The rain will come through the open roof and the sun too, and vines will creep up the walls of my room, and ferns will grow under my bed. There will be big white mushrooms and moss like little stars growing around the tree stumps that the salamanders climb on. And you, where will you sleep? I will sleep on a bed under the stars with the moon shining through the green leaves. Owls will hoot and crickets will sing, and next to me on the boulder, with his head resting on the soft moss, the salamander will sleep. Hi everyone, this is your host Josh Bennett, and these are Transnatural Perspectives. You were just listening to an excerpt from the book The Salamander Room by Ann Mazer, illustrated by Steve Johnson and Lou Fanche. A boy named Brian finds a salamander and brings it home to be his pet. His mother reminds him that the salamander needs many natural elements to survive that cannot be found indoors, and as a result, the boy reimagines his bedroom in a way that is nurturing to the salamander. The Salamander Room examines peace and conflict between nature and culture and could raise further examination on environmental ethics and aesthetics. But for today's guest, Victor Elderton, the Salamander Room is in many ways his own origin story and one that has led him through a life of imagination, exploration, and education in British Columbia. Victor has been working with nature-based learning and leadership for 30 plus years, primarily at the Chakamus Center just outside of Vancouver, Canada. He's currently working on a PhD at Simon Fraser University on the impact of place and nature-based experiential learning for students who attended the North Vancouver Outdoor School over the past 50 years. I have to say, I really enjoyed today's conversation. It's really a comprehensive story where we cover a range of topics surrounding Victor's emergence, upbringing, connection to the landscapes and cultures of British Columbia and Canada, and alongside with his human and more than human characters. So we meet a lot of different characters along the way. I recommend also keeping a notebook nearby because Victor does drop a lot of great reading suggestions as well as practice suggestions that you can use in your daily life. It's a bit of a longish episode. I did split it up in there in the middle, a little musical interlude if you need to take a little break or you want to take one part and then the next part later. But it's really worth it to stick around, get the whole story, because it's a good one. With that being said, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, stay in touch via social media or email, and share wherever you can. I really appreciate all the sharing going on, so please keep on doing that, because that's the best way we can get the word out there about this podcast. More info about the topics and contact information in the show notes, and without further ado, let's welcome Victor Elderton to the show and see you on the side for a little bit of reflection. Enjoy, everybody. We have a very special guest in the house today. I'm here in Oslo, Norway. Victor's over there in British Columbia. And
what I like to call the Canadian Southwest.
The Canadian Southwest. Yeah, well, I guess that makes sense, right? Because it's down south and towards the west. Which actually I was, I feel silly because I'm originally from United States. I just happen to live in Norway, And I was looking at the map today and I could not believe how close Vancouver was to Seattle. I don't know. I'm from Florida, so I'm from the complete opposite area, and I've never really been up there so much except for one time. And I was actually quite shocked. It blew my mind how close everything is. Actually, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. It looks like an amazing place to live.
Yeah, Cascadia is really, and I think that a lot of the kinds of ideas that I like to play with are because of the place where I live. It's figuratively it's called the Pacific Northwest. It's being called obviously a number of things. There's indigenous people all up and down the coast, and some of them probably predating the last ice age because of coastal migrations and things like that. So it's a pretty amazing place, and there's a lot of modern cultural similarities as well. Up and down the coast, and not only in sort of European colonial times, but the dependence on certain kinds of things. And I think it really starts to influence the way people think about this area. And I think it's deeply influenced who I've become as well.
Yeah. So give us an idea just a little bit. I mean, when I was looking at the map today of your area, it did have a kind of similar look when I look at places like on my map over here in Norway to like Oslo or Bergen. What are these bodies of water that you have going on there?
So that's a great question, because there's two types of water that you would typically get. You could have like open coastal waterways, which are directly connected to the Pacific Ocean, which are very exposed, very, very unique conditions. But then we have large islands, which protect us from the main flow of the Pacific. So if you think of a place like Oregon coast, for example, there are no large islands to the west of the Oregon coast. So you've got this big open coast with big surf, and you might have things like sandstone, like what we call haystacks and things like that. But most of the British Columbia coast, right up through Alaska, is protected by large islands, either Haida Gwaii to the north, a great archipelago of islands, or Vancouver Island, which is probably the largest of in the United States, what would be called the San Juan Islands, but in Canada we would call them the Gulf Islands. And so there's this huge coastal, fairly protected inland waterway, and it's not small, but it's definitely not big either. It will take by modern ferry about 90 minutes to get from Vancouver, for example, to Vancouver Island, which is a large island, and it's as large as England. I mean, it's not a small island. So so that protected waterway provides a lot of importance, not only in modern times, but in times with the first cultures that were here, because it isn't exposed to large bodies of open waves. So that's a very important characteristic of at least southwestern British Columbia, which is where I live, because of these conditions. But it also means some other kinds of things start to happen. It starts to change the physical environment as well. We get warming, moderating currents, Japanese currents they're called, that flow in this direction. And so we get these kind of warm waters. And it also means along the coast there are fairly high mountains. So I could imagine that you would think of it a bit like Bergen. Definitely, I've had the opportunity to visit Bergen, and there are aspects of Bergen that you kind of say, okay, close my eyes, am I actually in Vancouver or coastal British Columbia somewhere, or am I in Norway? It's pretty, there are some similarities that way. And so you get a significant amount of rain. We probably get a meter to maybe a meter and a half of rain annually. That's kind of typical. And like probably Bergen has, but Bergen's further north than we are. We're in the middle of a very unique kind of forest. It's a temperate coastal rainforest. So, temperatures typically don't get much colder than about 4 or 5 in the winter, and usually hover around 15 to 22 for about 6-7 months out of the year. I always like to say there's a couple of months when it's a little bit colder than that, and a couple of months when it's a little bit warmer than that, right on the coast. Now that can be completely different in the interior aspects of this region, but that's what it's like.
Yeah, it looks like an amazing area. I mean, I know I get a lot of guests here from Canada as a tour guide over here in Oslo. And many people tell me, oh, you gotta come to Vancouver. You gotta come to you would just love it. And looking at it today and hearing you talk about it, it seems like one of those places where as a human, living there, you really have a lot of opportunity to be out in the nature quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that it does influence. I've been asked that question a couple of times by different people over the years. And one of the things that I've always really found is that uh, it's close, but a lot of people don't take the opportunity to get out and about. Now, maybe that's changing a little bit over the last, few years. It definitely is close. So I think it's in a lot of cases a lot more passive than what you would expect. I think having friends in Norway and having visited Norway a few times myself, I would say physically being out and about is much more intrinsic to the culture of Norway across the board than it would be here. However, there is no excuse not to be out and about here. It's very close. One reason my partner and I chose to live exactly where we are today, where I'm speaking to you today, which is a place called North Vancouver, is because our home is basically at the southern edge of a provincial park, and within a block to 2 blocks, we can be walking trails that you could be in all day long. And for all of our time together, and even for myself personally, since I was like 1 or 2 years old, I've always had an animal companion. I've had a number of different animal companions, but definitely one way you could describe my life is a dog. A dog walks through it, or a dog sniffs through it, kind of thing. Yeah. So my earliest, when I was 1 year old, we got a puppy, and I've had a dog in my life ever since. And I think my partner and I, we now have I think it's the 5th dog that we've had together. And once again, it's really fascinating to sort of see how another species interprets the space, the physical space that we're in. And I always know that when we don't get a lot of snow these days, but when we're out and about in the wintertime and I can see all the little animal tracks, and my dog's nose has been tracking those animals, whether there's snow or not. Now my human eyes can see that, oh, there's a lot more here than I may have taken for granted that my dog was perceiving way before I ever did.
Interesting. So you say growing up, you've always had an animal companion, and the area has really influenced the place around you has really influenced a lot of what's led you to what you're doing today. Now, for those of you out there that don't know, Victor is up to a lot. I've seen in our email exchanges, people have this signature at the end under their name of, maybe where they studied or where they work or something like that. You have about 10 different things and a lot of abbreviations too. So can you give us a little bit of maybe reveal that later, but can you give us a little idea of just like how your upbringing influenced how you got into outdoor education?
Basically an urban suburban kind of setting, but also embedded into the forest. And I'm living in the same community that I basically grew up in.
Oh, okay.
And so this aspect of being really close to opportunities to get out and about and muck about in nature was really encouraged in my household. And we had a backyard that had second growth trees in it, where there had been original logging, and we had big old stumps in that particular area, western red cedars, which don't decompose really quickly. They have natural qualities that allow them to sort of sustain being in 1.5 meters of rain and not really decompose. And I had forts in there, my parents, with some parent support, and then later as I became older, we had sort of basically our own adventure playground that the kids in the neighborhood put together in the backyard, basically. So, mucking about in the backyard was something that was always interesting to me. And there are some aspects of some different people. I really, E.O. Wilson talks about an aspect of being biophilic, and I would tell you that I was a biophilic kid. right from a very young age. Um, and that was two things. I think I was continually being exposed to opportunities to interact with, frogs and newts and, those kinds of things. But I also had parents that were very encouraging in terms of what my discoveries were. It wasn't like I would bring something to show or have my parents look at things, but they would sort of be really interested in it. And it was really supportive in that particular way. So, sometimes the way I describe the way I grew up is that my friends might be out playing a sport or doing those other kinds of things. I would be the kind of kid that would be lifting up a log to see if there might be some insect growing underneath there or whatever. We live very close to a protected waterway, salt waterway. So, being down, looking at crabs on the beach and those kinds of things, all of those things were really encouraged. And though I wouldn't know it, and my father passed away a number of years ago, but my mom is still alive. She's 87 now. And, I sort of really credit both of them because my dad had a very playful way of being and liked to play with other people. We ended up living where I live today in the community of North Vancouver because as a child, him and his brothers would come from Vancouver and they would sort of do camping and they would be hiking all in the North Shore Mountains of North Vancouver. So when the brothers, thought it would be a good time to start their households, 4 out of 5 brothers all built households in the North Vancouver area. So that was kind of interesting. And all my uncles and my father had this sort of interest of, being out and about, but they also had this real play thing. My mom's much more the artist. My mom's much more of the detailed kind of person. My mom is much more on that side of things. So I think, looking back at it, I had the best of both worlds. Both parents were super supportive. But one parent, sort of brought out more maybe the artistic aspect of things because she was a drawer and a painter. And, even today at 87, though she can't get out physically so much, her garden is gorgeous. People commented on it all the time. But my dad was the one that sort of says, well, maybe you could build a fort out there. How would you go about building a fort? And, all this imaginative kind of play stuff. So, that was the world that I grew up in. And my parents had a very interesting way of dealing with me as a child because I was inquisitive like so many children. And I would sometimes bring home an organism and like a Pacific tree frog or a rough-skinned newt, which were fairly common in the area where I grew up. And I would say, could I keep this? And they said, well, how could you keep this? And so then they would send me on an inquiry project of how could you actually keep this? How could you do that? And there's a wonderful children's book called The Salamander Room, where a little child goes out, finds a salamander, and wants to keep the salamander in their room. Well, they keep the salamander in the room, and they continually change their room. They do more research, more investigation, more inquiry, and more things from outside come into their room until at the end of the book, the punchline is the child then recognizes they need to move their room outside where the salamander is, as opposed to trying to bring everything inside. And in a nutshell, if when people are asking me how did I get this way, what was my adaptation evolution to getting this point, I sort of said, if you've ever read The Salamander Room, that's me as a kid. I've basically moved from being inside and manipulating things inside to actually being in the space where the thing comes from. So that's it's a good young children's read, but it also kind of is an illustrative example of how I grew up.
There you go, everybody. Go out and read The Salamander Room. That's a good suggestion.
Yeah, it's a good kids book. It's a great kids book, really well illustrated, like all good kids books are. But it was me. And I taught for many years, and I taught young children for a lot of my years, and I would also bring it out. And then it was a way of kind of doing a little bit of a autobiography on who I was and why it was important to me. So that's basically, how I grew up in the kind of physical setting that I grew up in. Once again, it was a dance between culture, in this case, family culture, and the physical place, and how those two things are closely interwoven. And so if you ask me why I do the things I do, a lot of it has to do with that braiding or interweaving between, the human and the more than human, and how those two things braid together. And how can that be possible? I know it greatly personally influenced me, but I also think that it could potentially influence lots of other people. And of course, through a number of initiatives that I've had the privilege of being part of, that's been very important. I would also tell you that in this particular area, Indigenous culture is very important and very prominent. So I've always had a very strong interest with regards to Indigenous perspectives in terms of Indigenous cultures and how Indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest have interacted as well with the space and how they interpret the world. And my partner and I, we're working on trying to be allies to those kinds of cultural perspectives.
Okay, so we've got culture, we've got the arts, we've got education. How did this all wrap up? I mean, you grew up quite a bit in the outdoors. This was your upbringing. I mean, you could have done a lot of things. You could have gone and, I don't know, I heard there's a lot of lumberjacks up in Canada.
Yeah,
you could have gone and
it could have been resource extractor.
Yeah, you could have been a fisher person. Well, so what pushed you in this direction of education? And can you tell us a little bit about your work with education?
Yeah, absolutely.
What motivated that?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to my mom gave me a fish tank when I was very young. Actually, my parents gave me a fish tank when I was very, very young, and so I've had a fascination with fish for like a lot of my life. Salamander Room might be a biography of sort of how I grew up or how I came to be who I became, but I would also say fish are swimming through my life. There's a water thing, and it doesn't. And I don't think it's just because I was born in March, under the sign of the Pisces, but fish have been really important. So when I was like 9 or 10 years old, my parents asked me, "So what do you think you want to be?" And I sort of said, "Well, I want to be a marine biologist, and I want to be out studying fish. I want to do that." So, and I have kept fish all of my life. Or worked on fisheries projects for a lot of my life. And I'm always I find them fascinating. I still find them fascinating. So when I finished my high school years, I spent a lot of time in high school doing biology, ecology, those kinds of things in high school whenever I had those kinds of options to be involved with. In particular, I loved field ecology or field biology, which is the combination of not only sort of studying it from an academic perspective, but also getting out there, right? And collecting information. And so then I ended up, when I went to the University of British Columbia, I was very lucky. I mean, I was the first child basically in my mother and father's generation that had gone to any post-secondary education. So I sort of thought, well, I'm interested in biology. Well, I got a degree in terrestrial and aquatic ecology. And once again, the courses there that spoke to me the greatest were those courses that were field courses, getting out and about, investigating, trying to think about what those things might be. There were a couple of places as an urban suburban kid that really influenced me as well. Places like the Vancouver Aquarium, which is part of the Oceanwise network that's out there right now. That, once again, being an urban suburban kid, where do you get those kind of nature fixes? Yes, there was, out in the streams and collecting things and all that kind of stuff. So that's what went there. And while I was at university, actually, my expertise in looking after fish actually paid for a bunch of my tuition. I would sort of shop around and look for interesting aquatics labs and book myself out as a lab tech in those aquatic labs. I spent some time at the Vancouver Aquarium as an aquatics lab tech, while I was doing my studies. So my interest with regards to nature and those kinds of things, especially around aquatic environments, actually funded the kind of education. And every time I did it, it was like, I got another sort of enthusiastic infusion in terms of what I really like to do. So it was just like, okay, well, you like that? Well, try this. Oh, I love that too. So more and more and more of that. So as I completed my undergraduate work, however, I had two streams that I could actually follow. One stream might be towards research and becoming more of an academic, but I also found that was somewhat limiting. In a science perspective, at that particular time where I was, you had to really limit your perspective. You had to bring it down to a very, very tiny little, question that you would ask. And I just didn't think that way of looking at the world really related to the broader world. And so there was an opportunity to get my teaching certificate. As I was wrapping up my undergraduate degree in terrestrial aquatic ecology, and that became my real home because I could find ways that I could interweave communication, talking, discussion, dialogue with this really strong interest that I had in nature and those things that were not human, because they really inspired me. And so that's how I got into education, and then went in education, then did work once again in places like being a park interpreter, education interpreter at parks, at the Provincial Museum in British Columbia, at the aquarium for a short length of time. And all these places allowed me to sort of interact with people and try to excite them in the same way that I was being excited about, the natural world and how important that was. And I'm a firm believer that your emotions are really an important part of being engaged with nature, and why you would be concerned about how nature should be. And so that's how I got into that. And then from there, I looked for a teaching position that would really enhance that. And I was lucky enough at my very early part of my career to start working at field education centers. I worked for one in a local school district in Maple Ridge called the Loon Lake Environmental Education Center, where students would come and they would have this intensive week of outdoor environmental education studies, often intertwined with Indigenous ways of knowing the world. And then that led to my full-time career, where I spent almost 30 years at a place called the North Vancouver Outdoor School. And just as I was leaving that facility, we renamed it to a place name called the Chakamus Center. So now it's named after the river that the school actually sits on, and it's 165 hectares of very diverse temperate coastal rainforest. And while I was there, I completed my master's in science education with a really strong focus on informal and free choice learning environments. In my case, I really focused on things to do with being in nature, and also how nature starts to not only inform you and teach you, but also how it starts to influence who you become. So, and that's led eventually to the PhD work that I'm working on. I'm looking at a particular group of people who attended programs at that particular facility, because that facility now is just over 50 years old. It's 51 years that it's been going, and I'm particularly interested in other people's stories of how that particular place and that particular experience really influenced who they were, Josh.
So let's break this down a little bit. Sounds like a very interesting adventure. I just want to back it up a little bit. So when you were studying in your bachelor's, and then you were going around, and after you graduated, when you were working in a lot of these different kinds of museums and all these things places that you mentioned, I like the way that you talk about it, because you talk about it in such a like exciting way. Like, we were sharing the excitement of the nature and the animals and all this stuff. What was, other than sharing the excitement, was there something that you wanted to share about the excitement, or were there any particular issues? Also, like, what time period was this? Were there particular issues that were hot topics at that point that were like motivating you? What was the result of like the excitement that you were feeling, other than just like pure joy in the nature? Was there some kind of issues happening in the environment, or?
Yeah, well, there were definitely issues happening in the environment, but I have to say it was my sense of wonder that really motivated this whole thing.
Amazing.
That's why, in our emails back and forth, that's why I'm really fascinated by eco-imaginative education.
What is that?
Because, eco-imaginative education comes out of imaginative education, which is a group, and it's throughout the world. But there is a study group like that at Simon Fraser University here in the Lower Mainland, in Burnaby, actually. And in eco-imaginative education, they're interested in that aspect of human beings that is about imagination, but how is that also connected with nature? And I really draw a lot of inspiration from Dr. Gillian Judson, who wrote a little book called Eco-Imaginative Education. And I think it grew out of her PhD thesis, actually, where she wrote that. And then she's gone on to write a couple of books more recently, one called The Walking Curriculum, and that has a companion edition that also is based on the ideas of eco-imaginative education. So being in the environment and being, interacting with the environment, and how can we perceive that in imaginative kind of ways and not just sort of be limited by things. So where somebody else might have been really motivated by issues, I was truly motivated by, fascination and wonder. And I would say now that I've had an opportunity to sort of dive into this a little bit more, I'm interested in things that would be much more along the lines of phenomenological ways of seeing things, like the insides of things and the interrelationship of things, as opposed to, pulling that apart. And maybe, for example, now looking back at it, maybe that's one reason why I went towards education rather than being an ecological research student. In that ecological research, you were continually, sort of finding smaller and smaller and smaller kinds of ideas, as opposed to looking at the bigger ideas of how these things are all interrelated and the separation. And it's probably one of the other reasons why, I'm very interested in indigenous ways of knowing, because if you look at, Gregory Cajete's work, and, in a book like Finding the Sparkle, for example, about indigenous science, it's about the interrelationships of things. It's about how things, interact with each other, as opposed to sort of identifying that thing separately, And so I think that those kinds of ways of coming to know the world and coming to see it connected, later on, of course, at that particular time, and I'll just kind of give you a time period, I did my undergraduate work at the University of British Columbia from 1974 to 1978, and did my teacher training stuff in 1979, and then was qualified in 1980. So, I think that even at that time, people had started to be influenced. A lot of people point to 1969, the publishing of Silent Spring. and how important that was. But I see Silent Spring as also sort of an offshoot of a cultural phenomena that was happening at that particular time, which would have been the Vietnam War, and people questioning what are humans actually doing in the world. And so, I'm very much a product of that particular time. Was I thinking about it directly? Was I following Rachel Carson's work, in her sense of wonder, for example, and those kinds of things? No, I was not. But I really think the people that I was learning from, my teachers and my co-learners, we were being influenced by that, even if we weren't being influenced by that directly. And more recently, as part of my PhD work, I started to look into, this idea of learning with nature as co-teacher, does it have even, roots that even go further back? And I was actually shocked to find that around the turn of the 19th century, as it switched from the 1800s into the 1900s, there's this whole aspect of learning called the nature study movement. And this is a very strong study movement in education that talked about nature study. But nature study more than simply the perspective of going out and understanding the species name and the habitat and those kinds of things. It was a lot to do with the interconnectedness of things. And there's a couple of great books written about that. One is by Armitage and about the nature study movement. I was shocked to know that literally hundreds, thousands of children in school systems were really focusing on, looking at nature and the intrinsic aspects of nature, and whole school systems, whole school divisions really focused on that kind of stuff, Josh. And so then I sort of thought, well, why did we lose that? There was some really, really valuable things happening, back in, late 1800s, early 1900s, right up until 1920, 1930. And then when I started thinking about it, after I had done some of this sort of more scholarly work, investigating it, then I kind of thought, who were kids that maybe were influenced by that? Well, guess what? Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson were kids who had grown up during the nature study movement era. And they had been influenced in their early education by those things. In fact, if you do the Wikipedia thing and you go and look up nature study movement, it lists Aldo Leopold as one of sort of the people that were involved in that. So what I have come to know now, that some of my early learning was actually, that was influenced by people like Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson and populist science people in Canada. David Suzuki, he was a prof at my university. He taught classes while I was there, and he was talking about more than genetics. He's a geneticist, but he was talking about, this broader connection. It was exciting, and so I would say that for me, always, it has been an aspect of, one, my own personal excitement, and it's very heuristic, it's very much like, oh, the thing taps you on the shoulder and says, pay attention to me. Well, quite often I get these taps on the shoulder saying, pay attention to me. And so I started then to see how those things, those ideas have all kind of been woven together. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, like, Josh, if you were a student of mine, a young student of mine, I would sort of say, like, what are you fascinated with? And how can you and I go on a co-discovery of that thing? And so my interest has always been, even in my other work, in parks or whatever, yeah, sure, I would introduce an idea. But the idea then would be, how could we take that forward? Where would be the inquiry? Where would be, how could we go on like a co-journey together? And I would be learning things in the same way that you would be learning. now we're two individuals, so we'll be learning things in a slightly different, frame, but that's what we would be doing. So that's, for me, that's where it's been interested. That's what's interesting. Yes, did we have issues that were going on? You can think about issues around clear-cut logging. That was a big issue, for example, at that time in coastal British Columbia, because the idea was that we would just clear-cut these ancient forests and those kinds of things. But really, my motivation was I was fascinated about being in that place, being, sort of having that place wash over me, wash through me, those kinds of things. And now I understand that some of the ways that I was thinking were being influenced by ideas that, were being generated by Goethe, and sort of my new sort of a famous person of that particular time is Alexander von Humboldt. I'm reading a couple of things. There's a nice biography written about him called The Invention of Nature, and then a couple of other books. He was a contemporary of Goethe, and a little bit younger than Goethe, but apparently the two of them would get together and they would spend like weeks, days together, talking and thinking about nature, the interaction of things, and those kinds of things together. So von Humboldt, was a pretty fascinating kind of person himself. And so I'm now sort of understanding that in my tradition, in my sort of my Western tradition, I'm probably drawing upon some of those ideas. I've mentioned, Goethe and von Humboldt, but, moving from that to, people like, John Muir and people like that, into, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, David Suzuki. All of those individuals have had interest, even though there are some aspects of E.O. Wilson's work that people have problems with. I certainly understand, some of the stuff that he had worked on with regards to, this biophilia. And, there's a great biologist at Harvard who's passed away now. His name is Stephen Jay Gould, and some of their work. So those are the sort of the nature, culture people that have really influenced me. And then on an education perspective, I've always been sort of more in the camp, very much in a North American Deweyan perspective, with experience and learning from experience. And when we learn from experience, it changes how we might perceive the world. And Dewey, of course, in more modern times, I draw a lot of understanding from him.
So if I got you right, it sounds to me like a common thread that runs through a lot of your pedagogy, we could call it, is this idea of facilitating experiences and kind of being a co-learner along with other people to discover something. Could be many of different kinds of things.
Yeah.
How did that work? As you told me, you were. I hope I'm saying it right. The Chakamus Center or
Chakamus.
Chakamus.
Yeah.
So how did that, like, what were you discovering there? And you tell us how you set this place up, maybe in your role there, and how what were people learning there? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I came to the Chakamus Center as I was finishing up my my master's, my postgraduate degree from university. And I was very interested in contextual learning and learning through place or with place. And so I was very interested in how could you be working in a place that would be conducive to teaching and learning without being, directly saying, this is what you need to learn. And so when I came to the Chakamus Center, they hired me because I had had some experience working with indigenous peoples. And they had a project where, as a joint sort of community project, they were building a new Coast Salish big house. Like, this is a traditional house that a whole community or series of houses where a whole community would live together, intergenerational. And they were building one as a community project, but they also wanted to build a center that would allow people to get a sense of, how indigenous people had lived for thousands and thousands of years in that particular place. So when I came on board, myself and some other teachers, we sort of said, well, we can't tell you how people lived in this place. Maybe we should have an experience. So we brought together a group of Indigenous elders and Indigenous teachers, and we lived together for like 3-4 weeks at different times, not contiguously, but we lived together for about a week. Then we would go back and think about things and write things and come back. And so eventually the School District of North Vancouver, which owns the facility, developed this program called Skunawas. Skunawas means, in the Salish dialect from this particular area, together or working together. And so we thought that if we were going to actually try to understand, instead of teaching students as you might do in a classic sort of traditional museum kind of setting, we would just have them live there and cook their food in a similar fashion and cook the same kinds of food that people would have traditionally, and sleep overnight where the river is right next to your door, and those kinds of things. And then out of that, hopefully have a much more embodied kind of experience in terms of from obviously bringing a modern perspective. And the teachers were also Indigenous people as well. So they would be both modern people, but also connected traditionally to their past as well. So that's what we developed. And out of that, we had this amazing program still running today. So at the field school, then I spent a lot of time trying to create the opportunity for self-inquiry and also interaction. So the school, when I arrived, had a small farm. That farm now has migrated more towards an organic, biosensitive farm. Because it's a field center, an overnight field center, the food that is that's cooked there, we try to get as much of that from the farm itself. So it's try to make it as self-sustaining as possible. It also is right on this thing called the Chakamus River. Chakamus means chiak is it means place where people catch fish. In the Squamish language, mush means people or group of people, and Chakamus means fish trap. So Chiakamus means place where people had fish traps or places where people caught fish. And like there's Squamish. If some people are listening to this and they're climbers, Squamish is very well known in Canada as a great climbing area. Well, Squamish means the people that live close to this windy area because there's a lot of wind there. Squamish is also quite well known for outflow winds in the wintertime, but inflow winds in the summertime. So there's a lot of windsurfing and board surfing there because there's a kind of a standing wave where the Squamish River runs into Howe Sound, this fjord-like place. In fact, you could, in parts of Howe Sound, close your eyes and think once again you're in a fjord in Norway, where the school is kind of closely located. And so on the school property, there's big trees. There's a few trees that we think are close to 1,000 years old. There's a river that runs along it. And then we worked for many years. When I started there, we had reopened about 300 meters of spawning channel. And then what happened is that when I left there, we had pretty close to 2 kilometers, I think about 1.6 or 1.7 kilometers of re-enhanced spawning channel for wild salmon. So when I started there, I think we were really working with one species of wild Pacific salmon when I left. I think we were working with 5 out of the 6 species of wild salmonas that were spawning on the school grounds, where students would come and interact with the fish. And once again, it's an integrated learning environment. So it isn't just going out and measuring the fish and doing sort of this reductive kind of science work. You might be doing that, but you might also be sitting beside the creek watching the fish spawn and be writing poetry or making a drawing or looking at the cultural importance of salmon. You could be doing any one of those kinds of things in addition to sort of more like the field science school way of looking at the traditional field science school way of looking at things. So the idea was to provide educational programming at the Chakamus Center that enhances the learning. And the way I had it set up when I was there, because I was there for almost 30 years, I was there for 28 years. And while I was there, imagine that I had around 5,000 students a year that would attend the various programs that were at the center. We have the center still to this day has a program for 8-year-olds, a program for 10-year-olds, a program for 12-year-olds, and then a program for 16 to 18-year-olds. And in that program, those students actually come back and help us as teaching assistants. We call them counselors, and they work with the students in the cabins. I mean, there's we don't know what the future is going to be.
Check this out. I want to see what's happening on Canadian talk shows. I think, yeah. I mean, coming from United States, I mean, when you see clips from Canada, it's almost like it's similar, but not quite the same. There's a certain flavor to it, and I'm sure you've seen all our crazy shows that we have.
Well, yeah, and I think that's why Canadians are pretty good comics. There's a lot of Canadian comics, right? And the reason why is because I think we kind of get the humor from the Canadian side of things, but we also get the humor from the British side of things, right? So we've kind of we're a blending of those kinds of I guess Anglo-Saxon kinds of senses of humor.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, yet so many comedians come from Canada. It's wild.
Yeah, I mean, even starting with historic ones like Bob Hope, Canadian.
Really?
Yeah, Richard Little, the guy that used to do all of the things, modern ones. Jim Carvey, Dana Carvey, Jim Carrey, all of these guys. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike Myers, like more than half the cast of Saturday Night Live from the 90s was from Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, John Candy and all these other kinds of guys, and it's quite interesting because I didn't know this, but the Canadian comic show Schitt's Creek is big. It's a kind of a quirky thing. They're all Canadians, John, Levy and all these people. They're all Canadians. They came out of a group called, I think they were called Second City TV or something.
Yeah, that's right. SCTV and wow.
Yeah.
That's a whole other story. You got the great outdoors. You've got great comedians. I'm thinking all the time, and then I've met in more recent times, especially when we met at this conference. I thought, wow, so many great people from Canada talking all these great things. I need to go to Canada. They speak English there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and we can have some conversations and things like that, right?
Yeah.
Because as you know, like language is so important, right? And if you don't know some of the nuances of your language, what can you do, right?
It is. It's definitely Canada is on my radar of places
Yeah.
to investigate in the future.
Well, and I would certainly say there's a big difference. I have found there's a big difference between eastern United States and central Canada from the West Coast. So the West Coast definitely has a flavor to it. It definitely does. I would say there's a lot of cultural similarities, basically from, throughout British Columbia all the way to sort of Monterey, California. There's a lot of similarities. Now, as you get further south in Monterey, then I think you get more sort of Southern California influences, and it's a bit different that way for sure. And definitely, if you come from Florida, you would get a different sense of Canadians coming from Ontario and Quebec. A lot of them come to Florida, for example, but than you would on the West Coast. And the West Coast has much more of, I want to say, a cosmopolitan way, a multicultural way of looking at the world. I had a very nice thing that somebody from Atlanta, a friend of mine that lives close to Atlanta, said to me, one summer when they came a few years ago. He said, all of these people have all these different ethnic backgrounds and they all getting along. It's it's not what I would think, like, how is that possible? Like he understood how that was possible, but he said, here you are, you got all these different groups of people. And I think also, to tell you the truth, I think once again, the place starts to influence that. You have this warm, fairly moderate climate. You have easy access to physical resources. The Indigenous people certainly understood, access of resources from the sea and all of those other kinds of things. These thousands of salmon coming basically to your doorstep and providing you a source of protein that, is rich and, easily accessible. And then the other thing that Indigenous people had is they had the great, virgin growth. And so they found many different ways of using. So they had the building material, which primarily was the Western red cedar, but then they also had this protein source, and they both came together at the same time and in the same place. And so the cultures here up and down the coast flourished, and that's why they basically, in traditional sense, in a European or Western perspective, they were a traditional culture. They never had agriculture the way we think about agriculture. They did change the physical environment. There's a wonderful book written by a woman by the name of Nancy Turner called Earth's Blanket, about how Indigenous people in our area changed the landscape, but did it in a way that worked with the landscape, as opposed to certain types of agriculture that impose themselves on that place. And that's where I was talking before about the Chakamus Center. So we're trying to look at restorative ways of being in that place, as opposed to imposing what we're doing. So for example, if you think about our spawning channels, the spawning channels and the rearing channels and all those things now, I think that they probably now have, because I haven't been there since 2013, but I'm still involved with the center as an advisor, and I have many friends that continue to work there. I think they probably have close to 2 kilometers of places that they have re-enhanced. But what it is they looked for old river channels that over time, had just grown in, and they just reestablished them. And that's what the river channels are. So when you walk over the 165 hectares through the study trails and the exploration trails that are all over that piece of property, you would kind of look at this stream and say, well, it should have always been there. Well, it did exist there maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And all we did is found a way to re-water it and bring water back into that space. And there's a you may have seen this movie. It was called Field of Dreams. But the part of that book, if you build it, they will come. It's the same kind of thing. If you re-water something, they will come. So by re-watering these streams, by bringing water back into these spawning grounds, you bring the salmon, that brings nutrients back into the system. It increases the amphibians that start to come into those waterways. Some of the, smaller mammals like otters and those kinds of things start to come back into those spaces. So yeah, so the center itself is set up as, the best way I would have of describing it is an inquiry center, as a nature inquiry center. And so we try to work with individual teachers and say, well, instead of imposing what you want to do, tell us what you want to try and do, and let's see if we can find a place here on the property that would allow you to explore that question with your students, whether they be really young students, like 8 years old, which is pretty young, or whether they be older students, in upper high school. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now, in fact, Bob Henderson and I are trying to think about how we could use places like the Chakamus Center as a potential professional development center for educators to become inspired by the place and then take those lessons back to their place and create, opportunities where more than human can be explored in the way that David Abrams and Spell the Sensuous talks about those kinds of things. And so how could we do that? How could that be possible? So the difference I would tell you today from what I'm doing for the last, let's say more like the last 10 years, I'm very interested in how I can act more as a mentor, how I can set the stage for people like you, Josh, and other individuals to take this work forward, because I think it's really important work. Because unless we find a way within in culture, within the culture that that we have today, of reconciling our culture with the natural world, I think that our culture definitely will completely disintegrate. And I'm not necessarily too worried about some aspects of that. But saying that, I think that there's other ways of being, and I think that what are those ways of being, and what makes sense. So really today, I would say that I'm much more engaged with a term that I gained through reading Paulo Freire, which was praxis. The idea that you are physically involved with theory and practice to bring about some kind of transformation. So one of the books that I was talking to you about is Transformational Disruption, which was written by Arjen Wall from Wageningen University. He was somebody that I actually met through Wild Pedagogies. I actually met him indirectly through Bob Jickling. He had some students from Wageningen that were looking for field experiences outside of Holland. And Bob said, well, maybe one of your students would like to work with Victor at the Chakamus Center, which at that time it was called the North Vancouver Outdoor School. And so I had 2 or 3 of his students. So I had met Arjen, first of all, remotely, because these students were working on their postgraduate degree, and part of it was doing some international work. And so that's how I first met him, and then eventually met him at something like, I think probably the first time I physically met Arjen was at the WEEC conference that was the World Environmental Education Congress that was sponsored in Montreal. And I think Bob was the co-chair of that particular Congress. And then subsequently to that, one of the earlier Wild Pedagogies colloquiums, the one where we paddled part of the Yukon River, Arjen was on that. And so, yeah, so that's how I got to know him. But his work at Wageningen is very interesting because he talks about transformational forms of education. How can education be transformational in terms of helping us think about and asking some big questions? He has a wonderful short, I think it's 2 to 3 minute introduction to Wageningen University and the bigger educational questions that they're asking there about how education can be part of that.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be the ideal for education, to be transformative, to help us connect better with the nature around us, or the people around us, or just the place around us? One thing I was thinking was, as a practitioner, I would say, in the arts of facilitating these kinds of connections between the humans and the more than human world. Do you, just like a bit of a question out of left field, but when you go other places, because you sound very interwoven and entwined in the area, the place where you're in, can you think of any other towns or cities or regions that you feel like could be improved by this kind of or maybe are lacking? Do you see places like that are not entwined, places that are kind of deserts of this human nature collaboration or identification?
Yeah, I mean, any of the megalopolises that you can name, where you can't see, feel, touch, even it's not even on the horizon anymore. The first time I was in New York, that's where it really sort of struck me, because I could only see down the straight avenues of skyscrapers, and there was no real horizon that I could actually perceive at all. That's one particular place. I think, honestly, the places that look most like that, imagine out of some of the scenes of some of the Star Wars movies where the planet is completely built over by technology. Mm-hmm. There isn't even a suggestion that there would be places that would be valued other than the built up kind of world, kind of thing that's there. And so any places that get like that, I really have problems with. And even my first visit to New York, and I think I've only been there like twice or something like that. I went to an exhibit about what the Manhattan and the Hudson River was really like for indigenous people. It was like a mecca. It was like this amazing place with diversity and those kinds of things. And yes, it was, in quotes, a marshland. I heard the other day, I was listening to one of our public radio stations here the other day, and they were talking about the geometry of Washington, D.C. And when Washington, D.C. was being built, the guy was describing it as, well, it was a wasteland. It was a marshland. I was going, wow, just think about how that is embedded in the language, How is that actually embedded into the language? That a marshland, a wetland, would be seen from this architect's perspective as a wasteland. There was nothing happening there. Well, there's millions, billions of things happening there, that kind of stuff. So
yeah, it's actually pretty incredible too, because if you ever go out, one time I went out to to Long Island at the Hamptons area.
Yep.
And of course, everybody always thinks, oh, the Hamptons, that's just where a bunch of rich people live, which is kind of true. But there's a lot of wealthy people living out there. But there's actually some really amazing nature spots out there too. These wasteland marshlands that he was talking about.
Well, there's a really great organization, Josh, that I was part of, and I'm still affiliated with, but I was on their board for a while, called the Association of Nature Center Administrators. These are people that run nature education centers, both public, private, community throughout the United States in particular. But a lot of them are from the U.S. The U.S. East Coast and Southeast. And so I've traveled to interact with some of my friends there from time to time, and it's wonderful. And I am just blown away by the Outer Banks. All that sort of sand coastline from, let's say, Maryland all the way down basically to eastern Florida. It's mind-boggling, yes. and those marshlands and those things are, so imagine, something that isn't so built up. So I'm quite interested in how to do things. And I've even tried to change my own life that way. When we bought the house that we're in right now, the It was a standard kind of suburban kind of house. It had been around, for quite a few years. It's been around for just over 50 years now. Itself, it was built in 1965, and we're now in 2020. So, but basically, it was a house in the middle of two pieces of lawn. Well, those are deserts from my perspective, and so we've slowly brought the forest back in. And it's very interesting. We have our back neighbor, an elderly lady, from Denmark, and her backyard and our backyard now are little pieces, a little tiny pocket of an edge type temperate forest. And we were rebuilding our fence the other day, a few years ago, and she says to us, "Do we have to have such a tall fence? I know you have dogs." And she said, "We could put a door in, and the dog could come in my yard and your yard." And then we said, "Well, Mrs. Olson, you might not be there, all the time, and we don't really feel it's fair that our dog would be using your yard as well as ours. So our fence is the minimum that the minimum that it can be, because that's the kind of yard that we have. And so even in these, when we've been following the pandemic protocols that we have been doing at this particular time, it's a joy just to be out in the backyard. We've got the hummingbirds are coming through, and we've got various different types of native birds that are either flying through or they nest here. And boy, what a privilege. I just continually, walk out and just think about what a privilege that I have. So your first question was, are there places that really sort of jar me? And I think the places that jar me the most are where there isn't any hint that anything but the built-up industrial world exists. There's no sense of that. And I've been to some of the larger, cities of the world, like Tokyo, for example. But even in Tokyo, there are these small little vignettes of things. There's these small little places, but still, it's so built up, it's not really obvious to me, and those are the places that cause me the greatest hurt, and stuff.
Well, yeah, one reason why I bring this idea up too is I think of course you're always relating, things from where you're from. To me, it's very fascinating to hear about where you come from. It's like you said, everything's intertwined and interwoven, the nature, and I see that a lot here in Oslo too, where I grew up in South Florida, and I'm glad to use this word, in the megalopolis. It was, I would say, probably quite the opposite of quite a different place on the spectrum, because very much, there used to be these beautiful marshlands. There used to be all of these, Native Americans, First Nations people living there. And now it's like that song, they turned it into a parking lot. They turned paradise into a parking lot.
Also written by a Canadian, by the way.
Canada's the place.
Joni Mitchell's song.
Yeah, exactly.
She lives in, remember I was saying before, we have some of those guarding islands. She lives on or has a home on one of the Gulf Islands.
Of course,
I think she's on Salt Spring or something like
really
that.
Really nice one.
Yeah. Well, they're all pretty nice, I'll tell you. The thing around here, though, it's like any other place. I mean, I think it's, so you're asking, your questions have a lot to do with like what motivates you. Well, I'm trying to help people, including myself, think of these things in a more purposeful kind of way. Instead of having them, just sort of tucked back in the back of our brains, how do we bring that forward? How do we make it more, not immediately conscious about this, but how do we make it more sort of easier to tap into? As opposed to having it really back in some recesses somewhere. How can we do that? And I'm also interested in, I think that there's a big thing in my work about how we can influence early childhood learning. So, for example, if we think about issues around the pandemic, the COVID-19 and the pandemic protocols that we put into place to guard people, to guard some of our most fragile individuals. It's a real tragedy from my perspective that, 80%, I think, of the people who have passed away in Canada at this particular point come from care facilities, from senior care facilities. And there's going to be some damning reports, but I also heard on public radio this morning, yes, it's obvious, because of these deaths, people are concerned, but these are issues that have been documented for years before this in terms of underfunding, in terms of not, paying people a reasonable wage for, assisting, elders and those kinds of things. So these are issues that have been pointed out in probably multitudinous kinds of reports. But one of the things that we're thinking about is how can we safely open up schools? Well, what we're starting to understand, and I think anybody in wild pedagogies would understand this, schools have a whole bunch of different purposes to them, and some of it is learning in terms of the formal aspects of learning, but some of it is also about the socialization and collaboration between individuals. So think of a future, for example, where and I have many active teachers. I was an active in-person teacher, and for most of my career up until 2016, when I officially retired from working directly with younger students, and now work more as a mentor with older university age students. How many minutes a day actually do you have to be working directly with kids? And my teaching friends are saying, well, an hour or two, I guess, total. So why are you there for 6 hours? And what are you doing with those other 6 hours? What are you doing with those other 4 hours? Are there more imaginative, and this is the work that Imagination Education tries to do, are there more imaginative, inquiry-based opportunities that we could be engaging in that would be more relevant than sitting at a desk, for example, for 6 hours, kind of thing, inside most of the time, right? And I think that there are some ideas that are coming out of Scandinavia. I think of some of the ideas, in Norway around, the teaching of philosophy, for example, and those kinds of things that I think, in the big picture, might be way more important, and how could that become more of the norm? And my real fear is that, there's almost like, the machine wants to work in a certain direction, and it's still trying to work in a certain direction as opposed to changing direction or being a completely different kind of machine altogether. And maybe even the machine's the wrong metaphor to use here. Maybe the better metaphor is, how could our education system be much more like what, like some kind of mycelial net, which was totally interconnected, as we see in the fungal world. I mean, there's some really fascinating things. There's a new book coming out. I don't know if it's published yet, written by Merlin Sheldrake, and he's a mycologist. And I came across his work through a book called Underland, which was basically exploring those things that are below our surface, and written by the same person that McFarland, who wrote an interesting book about the words that were being taken out of the Oxford Dictionary and being replaced by techno words, and they were all nature words that are being taken out because they only can allow a certain number of words or something like that. And it's a book McFarland wrote called The Lost Words. It's kind of poetry and imagery at the same time. Anyhow, Sheldrake talks about the fact that when it comes to mushrooms or the mycelial world, is there actually a beginning and an end to that? Because it's so integrated, and it challenges our classic definition of what is an organism. Because where does it begin and where does it end? Those kinds of things. So, I mean, I think my job these days is to try to help, new leaders or emerging leaders, new teachers think that there are other possibilities. And I'm not going to denigrate any of the personal tragedies that have been happening. Probably today in the United States as we speak, over 100,000 people will have died from the virus. Like it was 900, it was 99,000 and something yesterday. So more than likely it will top 100,000. As somebody pointed out, I mean, it's mind-boggling, and to think that all has occurred from the beginning of March until now, the end of May, like in
Insane.
3 months. Like that's insane. March, April, May, in 3 months, right? So I mean, I don't want to denigrate that, because that's a personal tragedy. There are many, many, many personal tragedies, but I also understand a little bit, by being out and about, these kinds of things, these kinds of issues happen in nature. And so what's the response to that? How do we want to respond to that? So I think that the work that I'm doing now is, how do we respond to this ecological challenge that we're in? How do we respond to that? What should our response be? I'm an educator, so I'm going to take it from that, because as I told you before, the reason that I'm an educator is because to me it was a really great way of marrying this intrinsic interest in nature and how the living systems work, to me, and also how to engage people in that. That's why I'm an educator. So that's it's an interesting question, and I think it's really important for us to have be very respectful with regards to a grieving process. But I also think at the same time, we have all lived through personal tragedies. I've told you before that my father, was very important to how I grew up. When I lost him, many, many years ago now, it was something that took me a while to work through. There was the immediate aspects of grieving, but there were other kinds of things with regards to that. But there was also a particular point, and I'll tell you right now, part of my recovery was coming to a better understanding about how I was a part of and an extension of the planet. And when I started to come to those kind of realizations, and then the sad part of that, Josh, was the fact that, my dad taught me a lot of things, and there, once again, after his passing, he was teaching me something else once again. So in his passing, he was teaching me that, hey, this is something that you have the privilege of being aware of, and you have the privilege of interacting with. And maybe I would have come to those kinds of conclusions. I'm not sure whether I would have or not, but at the end of the day, it's a scenario where without his guidance, would I have come to it the same way? And, I credit a number of the people. In particular, I want to, Bob Jickling in particular, because Bob and I have been working together on different projects now for decades. Would I have come to these kinds of ideas? Maybe. But once again, I think that that's the role of a great facilitator or a great teacher, or whatever you want to call them, is that, they kind of set the stage and make my learning possible. So if I'm asked, like, why you do this, what are you trying to do? I'm just going to say, well, I've had the privilege of working with some people that kind of set the stage, including some things that are not human, that have set the stage and made things possible. And that's kind of, the journey that I'm on.
That's great. It's been really great talking to you today, Victor. I think you've taken a lot of ideas. I think that a lot of us, maybe people listening, think about, like, kind of how to describe your own journey as an educator. Sometimes these things can seem very abstract. personally, I think a lot of people feel that way. As a facilitator, what is that really? And I thank you very much for shedding a lot of light on that topic today. I'm gonna round things up today, but I definitely would like to do this again soon, because I think we have a lot more to talk about. I'd definitely like to get into some more about wild pedagogies, and especially indigenous learning and these types of things. So maybe we can get together soon and talk about that again.
Yeah, I'd love to. I really enjoy these conversations. I love these conversations with people that I know, friends, colleagues. But I also love these conversations and people want to engage in these conversations. That's if there's any hope out there, it's the fact that I think that at least that there's a certain cadre of individuals that want to engage in these conversations. And if they want to engage in these conversations, and I can, I try to make the time for that. So I hope that it's valuable. Certainly, every time that I have an opportunity, there's a really interesting two people I want to do another call out to. There are two great people in the United States that are really into nature journaling. John Muir's Laws, and the other person is Emily Ligren. They have produced outstanding books on nature journaling. The most recent one, Emily just put out on teaching nature journaling. But John Muir Laws has a number of different things that he talks about. And one of the things that I think was really interesting, he said that if we talk our ideas out loud, it actually forces our brains to process them more. If we don't talk them out loud, I'm not saying that they won't stick, but if we talk them out loud and we have a dialogue, as today we were having a dialogue, a talk back and forth, then I think that there's an opportunity for those ideas to become more deeply embedded, maybe more deeply understood. I think that that's really important, because John Muir Law says that in any object there is more information than you could ever process yourself. So your brain is very good at throwing out information. So the point here is, how do we slow that down? How do we slow that down so that we can pay attention? And if you think about, our trip up to Arnonessa's cabin, for example, this summer, one of the most important takeaways for me for that was, Ness's idea is that he could learn more in 10 meters from his cabin than climbing any mountain in the world, if he really chose to pay attention to those 10 meters around his cabin. So that there's so much there if you really want to be attentive to that. And that's kind of what I'm trying to ask people to do, is be attentive to the kinds of things that you're doing in your engagement. And so I think that that's a little bit of what we're trying to do in wild pedagogies. We're trying to sort of be attentive to those kinds of things. So
yeah, and that's what was great about reading this book and then attending that conference, walking conference that we met at, was it's a really nice book that they put together, because it gives you kind of a checklist as a educator, or really whatever you're doing. Because I mean, I'm a big probably my favorite part of this whole idea is this idea of being an activist. No matter what you're doing, you're kind of, whatever you're doing, I mean, whether you're consciously or unconsciously, trying to push an idea, or you're just being an activist via your activity, and there's some kind of something being created from that. I just love this idea, because no matter who you are, you don't even need to be an educator. You could be a lawyer, you could be a artist, you don't need to be an official certified teacher or something like that to use this kind of stuff. I mean, really, with the stuff that we're talking about of climate change and all these big issues, existential issues, COVID-19, everything that's surrounding us now and concerning us now, we need everybody in this together. We need the lawyers.
Everybody's got to be into it.
Doctors,
Absolutely.
Everybody.
Yep.
So we need to attack from all sides, really. So why would you be doing anything else right now? Our survival depends on it.
Yeah. It can't be an enclave of a certain group of individuals. It just can't be. You've got to bring everybody into this. And I think that Robert Bateman is a very prominent natural history artist in Canada, and he happens to be a friend. And he says that nature's complex, but it's more complex than we can understand. And what I take away from that kind of a statement is that nature also provides multiple entry points. That means that it allows people to come at this from so many different ways. And we're all talking about this thing that we call nature, or the more than human, kind of aspect of that we're trying to talk to people about. But I think the other part of that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make people, or not make people, but help people be more actively conscious of that, as opposed to it just being like this image behind me here, as opposed to it just simply being a backdrop.
Yes.
Being, and what I like to say, you asked that question. I think it was a good question. Are there places on the planet that hurt? The only way that I can survive in those places is I bring images like this one with me, because they're inside of me. They're embodied inside of me. So I don't like to be in those spaces for lots of time. I have to say that. But I bring this kind of stuff with me. I bring, that with me. And there's an interesting analogy. You could try it yourself, okay? So, in Norway, they have a lot of hydroelectricity. In Canada, in part, like most of the electricity that we use in British Columbia is hydroelectric, developed where I live. Yeah. And so we have these big transmission lines. Okay. So one evening, when it's pretty dark out, take a fluorescent light bulb, like a tube is better, and take a fluorescent light bulb and walk underneath those high electrical lines, and the light bulb will start to glow. And it's just because of the ambient electromagnetics that are going on. It's exciting the phosphors inside the light bulb. But here's something that I thought was really interesting, because there was these big power lines that go through the middle of the Chakamus Center, go through the outdoor school where I was working. So we did this experiment one night with students. And so we took the light bulb, and the light bulb wouldn't glow until we were right inside the field. So once we were right underneath the hydro lines, the light bulbs basically turned on. And I didn't expect this. When I walked away from these high tension lines, the light bulb continued to glow. And interestingly, it actually worked to pull the electromagnetic field with it. So once we got far enough and we grounded the light bulb again on the ground, we were just holding the light bulb, okay? And we held it up at the same place that we had just had it glowing. It wouldn't glow anymore. We had to go back into the electromagnetic field. It would start glowing, and then you could draw it out again. Because, of course, you were drawing those that electromagnetic field to the light bulb, right?
Wow.
So that analogy is kind of the way I deal with spaces that I find hard to be in. Places like this are the electromagnetic field. And when I go to those other places, I'm actually drawing some of the energy, some of the influences, some of how that kind of place has influenced me. And it would be the same, for example, now that I've been next to the glacier, during wild pedagogies. I'm pulling some of that energy from the glacier inside me to wherever I'm going to go now. And by having those kinds of experiences, that's how I've come to understand how I cope with some of that stuff, because I'm drawing that stuff away. I did a presentation once, this is when, you never see them hardly anymore, but when we had slide images, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I had a slide image in my pocket, and I was asked to do a keynote. And I was saying, when I stand inside this room, and it was a classic sort of conference room, I sort of said, I think of this. And it was a picture from my backyard. I said, you can't see this, but this little image is my backyard, and how that backyard is influencing how I am. So I have drawn some of the energy from my backyard to this space. And when I do that, then it helps me sort of set this space into some kind of a context that I can actually interpret. So that's the way I've come to sort of see it myself. Is that wherever we go, we are actually, and I want people to be more, actively conscious of that.
Yeah, no, I think I know. I think I see what you're getting at there too. I mean, I've had this idea before that, it's kind of like the mushroom that you were talking about before. Like, where does it begin and where does it end? And this is something interesting that I found. And I actually I did a presentation on this one time, a long time ago, when I was doing outdoor studies, about this idea of, through experience, you can get lost in a place, right? And then you can go someplace else and you can get lost in a totally different kind of place. But because you had that experience of being lost in one place, then you kind of have a better idea of how to get unlost in another place.
Correct.
Maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's all trial and error. Of course, it's kind of a collection of experiences. But over time, through this experiential learning kind of thing, you begin to figure things out. This is how you learn how to figure things out.
And the more you do it, the easier that it kind of becomes. I think once you've had those kinds of experiences. So the one reason why I like working with young learners is, how do I set the stage that they can trip that switch easier, that they can tap into that easier, to the point that it becomes almost the natural, if to use that terminology, the natural state. This is what you're doing all the time.
That's really cool to hear too, and I really like this. I really love the word facilitator, because I think for a lot of people who are teachers or educators or outdoor activity coordinators, whatever you want to call it, I think not everybody. Some people really are like, I'm teaching you a skill, but there's a lot of us out there that I know I myself always feel a bit more abstract in my role. I'm like, well, yeah, I'm kind of facilitating. I'm not. Yeah. I'm not exactly a professional in this, canoeing thing right here, but I'm going to make sure everybody's safe and we're going to have a good time, Yeah.
Another way I've come to think about it too, Josh, is that we're kind of curators.
Yeah. I've used this word
kind of
before.
Curators.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I think that we're actually, as educators, we're trying to curate things, and the way we curate things are kind of based on our interests and our filters and our sort of ways of coming to see the world, right? So, but I think there's two things there. I think you need to be as honest as possible about, the filters that you're trying to bring, or the filters that you do bring. And two, open the door so other people can be curators, so other people can do their own thing. And it isn't just your way of doing things, right? And that this hegemonic way of looking at things, it's my way or the highway kind of thing. And I think that that's something that we're trying to work on for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very, very interesting. I love this. To be honest, I could leave it open for people to chew on some of this information until next time.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. Great, Victor. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. And we'll definitely, what a pleasure to talk with you. And thanks for sharing your time.
Well, and thanks for giving the opportunity for having like a dialogue and an open space for that, and so I wish you all the best.
All right, and welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this auditory journey with Victor Elderton and myself. We covered so many topics today, and I can see that there is this kind of thread tying all of this together, and that is, at least what I'm seeing, is this connection to one's place, being interwoven into one's place, maybe we could say. After listening to Victor's story, I can imagine him just like emerging from the temperate fog of the Pacific Northwest and eventually becoming part of some starry night sky. Anyway, so I think that something fun and maybe kind of eye-opening to think about is how one's place and the surrounding culture and environment can influence your being, and also to think about how your being meshes with all of that, or does it? Maybe you don't feel so connected. Maybe you should check yourself and ask why. Likely, you're more connected than you realize, just maybe not in the most obvious ways. As our anthropocentric existence evolves, we may feel disconnected from our origins in many ways. However, the connections have just become maybe a bit abstracted. Anyways, that's our transnational perspectives for this week. We can always keep the conversation going in our communities, at home, or online via our social network and media outlets. Please don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast. And thanks for tuning in, everybody, and enjoy. Have a good one.